This video is brought to you by Aura. I am obsessed with Succession. I've made 2 videos about it, now 3. I made an entire podcast about it called Suck Off. I've listened to the entire official podcast about it. I've watched through the entire thing 3 times. I own the scripts of the first 3 seasons in physical form, waiting for the 4th to get delivered. I threw a watch party for the season 3 finale, and a watch party for the season 4 premiere. So you're right to assume that I have been a very sad boy since it ended. Usually I try to get reviews out as fast as possible while still giving the film or show time to soak itself into my brain. Succession has clearly taken longer than usual. Even this feels a bit too early in my opinion. I would rather actually watch the entire 40 hours or so one more time, but I'm itching to get my thoughts out and I don't know how much longer I can wait. Let's be real, this probably won't be the last Succession video anyway. Really, I just felt a sense of pressure for this video, especially from myself, to make this last Succession review count. Again, clearly this show is something so special to me. I don't relate to any characters necessarily, but I do find many of the themes within the show to hit a very real place. Their desire and the places that desire comes from can be extremely relatable and human, even if some of the things they desire are seriously unrelatable. The characters in the show are hilariously wealthy and powerful, that it reaches a point where money means nothing to them. They were born with power, but they aren't competent enough to do anything with it. They feel this need to run the company because that's what they were born into, with no idea why they want to do that or what to do with it once they do run the company. They've spent their lives chasing something they don't even really want. They're just built to want it. As Roman puts it in the end, they're bullshit. And by stripping away this reason to exist, basically, where money and comfort are already there and all your relationships are transactional, the show really becomes about what these people do need to be happy, and in doing so makes a very human show about people I could not relate to less. I'll talk more about these desires and themes at some point in this video, but to simplify it, I just really like this show, and I really want to do it justice. So instead of trying to condense how I feel about the entire thing into 10 minutes or so, I'm going to forget about condensing altogether and just simply talk about everything I love about it, now that it's over. I mean, I can't talk about every episode and every line of dialogue and every storyline, that's unreasonable, and I do feel like we cover each individual episode about as much as we can in our recap podcast, Suck Off. So for this video, I'll be focusing mostly on Season 4. That's the most interesting thing to talk about. I'll talk about what works about it, what doesn't work about it, how I feel about each character's endings, what my takeaway from the show is, the themes of the show that really resonated with me, and hopefully by the end I'll feel satisfied. Even though I know I still won't feel satisfied. So, without any further ado, let's start with a quick word from today's sponsor, Aura. Aura can identify data brokers exposing your info and submit opt-out requests on your behalf. Brokers are legally required to remove your info if you ask them to, but they make it super hard to do, so let Aura handle it for you. Aura also does so much more to protect you and your family from online threats you can't see. It's really easy to set up so you don't have to download several different apps to get things like parental controls, antivirus, VPN, password management, identity theft insurance, and more. You get everything at one affordable price. I have too much going on in my life. I can't be keeping track of things like this, so I really appreciate the fact that Aura will notify me if they find my information on the dark web. It's super helpful, so I can act accordingly. And that's their whole thing, right? Let Aura do the hard work of keeping you safe online so you can focus on other tasks with peace of mind. You can either let people continue to exploit and profit off your private information, or you can go to aura.com/Karsten to start your 2-week free trial, also linked below in the description. All right, let's start with some general finale thoughts. I mean, my initial thought the second the credits rolled after the finale was that it was pretty damn good. I thought that similar to much of the show, everything that happened made perfect logical sense, yet the way they told it made it all shocking. That's a quality of the show I never noticed until episode 3 of this season, Connor's wedding. Logan died, and it was one of the most shocking episodes of TV I had ever seen. For days, I was in a weird headspace. I couldn't function. Easily the most shocking moment of the series, yet everyone knew it would eventually happen, right? I mean, they even hint at it in the pilot of the show. We just didn't know it would happen like that, and that's what makes it brilliant. It's satisfying, which is a weird word to use, but it also challenges the viewer. You think the death of the main character of the show will be this big, dramatic thing, but instead they treat it like real death. It happens really fast in the most anticlimactic way, and because of that it shatters the worlds of both the characters and the viewer. And that's how the finale felt as well, with the added bonus of being one of those finales that makes you rethink most of the show. Because, you know, the show has been building up to a winner, a successor, the entire time. I think it's super fun that after after years of reading things online and debating with friends over who made the right move and who didn't, we can now look at it a bit closer and see what moves were better than we thought they were, and vice versa. But the brilliance of the show is it isn't that black and white. It isn't like Tom was flawlessly scheming his way up the entire series. It's been some ups and downs. And there's also the fact that the guy they're all trying to be to impress is dead, and we'll never truly know who he would actually declare the successor. That's just what keeps the show juicy and alive well after it's over. That crossed out Kendall Roy thing is gonna haunt me for the rest of my life. On a side note, it's funny to call the things that Tom does the right things to do, right? But that's what makes it such a fun show, right? Getting lost in this whirlpool of power plays and cycles of abuse the same way the characters do. You spend 5 episodes hoping Kendall comes out winning, and when he does win and starts being a piece of shit, you're like, whoa. And there's nothing wrong with that. It just proves that the show is extremely compelling. I'm already going off on a tangent. Anyway, the finale specifically was kind of the perfect example of this, and in a lot of ways snaps its audience back into reality the same way it does the characters. You'd be surprised how many people I've talked to who have been like, I'm so mad that Kendall didn't win. Have you been watching the things he's been doing in the last 2 episodes? Are you kidding? But that's something I find really gripping about it, specifically this season. You spend most of it rooting for the siblings, or at least I was. That's who the show wants you to root for, in a way, getting you to empathize with them at a deeper level than you have the entire show with Connor's wedding, feeling that sense of drive to keep the business in the family for Dad. And then there's the smaller wins along the way that feel triumphant. You kind of want to see them keep winning. They also paint Mattson out to be slimier than he already was. He's kind of the villain this season. More on that later. They suck you into this same delusional whirlpool each sibling is stuck in, which makes the reality check at the end of the episode tragic, but not cynical or like a downer. I mean, hey, there is something pretty satisfying about seeing Tom in control, but again, more on that in a second. So that's to say, especially now that I've sat with it, I really do think they stuck the landing way better than I even expected. It has a perfect balance of being both shocking, yet also satisfying, tragic and devastating, yet a breath of fresh air, conclusive, but also leaves you wanting more. And speaking just about the finale, for how much there was to wrap up, this final episode doesn't feel crammed or rushed, and yet this still manages to take care of a lot of the loose ends. There's more to say, obviously, but to properly get into certain themes, I might as well go into the characters. I've come to realize that because of how many storylines are overlapping, the best way of reviewing and recapping Succession is to go character by character. And let's start at the bottom with the side characters. Succession has a lot of side characters who, despite being just side characters, come with their own rich backstories and personalities. It is amazing that from an outsider's perspective, the show really does just look like one room full of suits after another. It's really impressive to me that they were able to make so many different unique personalities under this one weird umbrella that is Waystar Royco. That was one of my biggest realizations during season 4. If the show were to keep going, I think there's so much they haven't done yet with just the old guard. I mean, Carl and Frank had one hell of a season, if we're strictly speaking silliness. And just so we're clear, when I refer to side characters, I'm referring primarily to Frank, Carl, Hugo, Carolina, Rava, Rhea, Nan Pierce, Naomi Pierce, Sandy, Mencken, Nate, Jess, Comfrey, Gil, Carrie, Caroline, Peter, Lawrence, Ewan, Stewie, even Marcia. There's also a bunch others that I'm not even mentioning. I don't really feel the need to get into all of their business. For some, I don't even think there is much to get into. But I think they all share a certain thing about them. The thing about these people is that they're either just family members who have their own lives going on and are comfortable outside of the business, or they just do the business and don't get wrapped up in the family of it all. Something to keep in mind. That's something I really love about the last note of this show. It's how well things turn out for most of the side characters. To a lot of them, life will go on pretty much exactly the same as it was before. You have to remember this is just another deal at the end of the day for most of them. Jess drops Kendall and gets out. Rava's future isn't super clear, but it seems like the same kind of thing. Ewan got his word out at the funeral and will probably just fuck off. Stewie does what he's always done, follows the money, and it works out for him. Carolina seemingly gets things her way against Hugo. Hugo's really the only one that doesn't seem to be in a good place at the end of all this, and that's because he hitched himself to Kendall. Not to mention Colin as well, who I just feel bad for. He didn't deserve that. Most of the folks are either free from the company with a golden parachute, free without one, or just getting back to work. And that's a part of the ending that I really liked. Looking back at it, even if there was a part of me that wanted the siblings to rise above the Swedes and take back the company, to see Kendall win at the end of it all, it really would go against much of what the show is saying. This idea that family and business can succeed together in the end. The note I'm left with in the end, if I'm looking at just these side characters, is that one of the smartest things you can do in this show is just mind your own business, which brings me to Jerry. I wish I got to see a little bit more of her and Roman before the end. Some more of her input in general near the end would have been fun, but I get it. It makes sense. They want her as far away from that man as possible. It isn't the kind of show that'll crowd please like that either, and again, it makes complete logical sense that Jerry would just kind of blend right back into the suits at the end. We've seen her be incredibly manipulative in a good way, and I have no doubt in my mind that she's gonna get whatever she wants through Tom of all people, so she is sitting pretty nice at the end of the series. Jerry is an incredible character and adds a lot to the show, but it's hard to talk about her like she has much of an arc or much of her own story. What I mean by that is she's kind of the poster child for these side characters, in that she more than the others is roped into the Roy family by way of Roman. Yes, she goes along with it at first, and it's hot, of course it's hot, but I see her win at the end of the show as being pretty triumphant next to everybody else. She's one of the few main characters that has little wrong with her ending, aside from being under Tom, but again, that can work in her favor. I call it a win because Jerry was, for a second, a tragic character, essentially giving Roman an inch and him taking a mile, eventually briefly hurting her reputation at the company and almost getting fired a handful of times. Which isn't to say she doesn't care about him or have empathy for him. I think she does see something in him that isn't in the other siblings, and she definitely shows empathy in the funeral scene. Apparently there was a scene between the two of them that got cut in the funeral episode. So clearly it's not like she hates him or anything, but I do think she escaped something. By the end, for the sake of her own future at the company, she strays pretty far away from him, which is more tragic for Roman than it is for her, but I also do think it's a little sad that she, for the sake of her own career, can't really spend time with this guy. For most of the show, Jerry has preached this idea of how does this serve my interests? There's this subtle nod to this at the end of season 3 when Roman comes running to her for help and she asks him the same question. But while we don't see much of Jerry in these final episodes, because she pretty much blends right back into the workplace, I think her success near the end makes the case that always taking into consideration what serves your best interest is a worthwhile plan in this environment. I mean, just look at Tom. It kind of works for him, but like anything in this company, it'll mean sacrificing certain things. And for Jerry, that's a genuine connection she had to Roman. Let's talk about Matsson. As I briefly noted, Lucas Matsson served as the villain this season, the new Logan to impress and take down in a sense. He's also the villain because he isn't Logan. But calling him the new Logan is funny, because in episode 9 of season 4, the hierarchy kind of changes again when Mencken, being the one to impress, enters the room, and seeing Matsson clam up the way he does was pretty funny. In that sense, being the villain, they use him about as much as they need to this season, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't itching to know more about him and his crew. Oscar specifically added a weirdly ominous presence to this show that I wish I got to see more of, specifically that night with Greg. Matsson is this new hip tech guy we've kind of known the entire show. A different version of Lawrence Yee is how I'm looking at it. And this kind of guy is in some ways a fear of Logan's, or at least he was, but he's the exact type of guy this company has been pining for the entire show, so it makes total sense for him to take over at the end of the day. And he kind of, got what he wanted at the end. He's one of the biggest winners here in a really fucked up way. He got a US CEO that he can use like a puppet. He's probably gonna have a weird sex thing with Shiv that I don't want to think about. And he bought Waystar. I really don't have much else to say about him for this reason. He wins, and this feels like the beginning of a new show, so it's hard to say it feels like a proper arc. I liked him a lot, though. I think Alexander Skarsgård blended right in with the crew. He was a great character. It was a perfect guy to buy the company in the end, because in some ways he's the right guy, and in some ways this being the new face is laughably grim. And then there's Connor. I've been itching for more Connor this entire show, and while season 4 could have definitely used some more of him, I feel pretty satisfied with what we got. Alan Ruck is straight up one of the most underrated actors on this show. He has played this character so perfectly and proved in season 4 episode 2 that he can bring a real dramatic side to him if he wanted to. As much as I wanted more Connor, you kind of do realize why there is only so far you can go with his character. The president thing was it was obviously never going to happen. And he, more than the rest of the kids, is definitely not a serious person. He's barely a person at all. I feel like I speak for a good amount of fans when I say if they ended Connor's arc in this show at Connor's wedding, it would have worked, because in some ways it feels like the end to his story. Going back to this idea of family not mixing with business, Connor is an example of someone in the show who prioritizes family, who wants family, and his motives are that he's never really felt like he had one. In that wedding episode, he's able to look past the death of his father, someone he could barely see as a father, and prioritizes his own future for a moment. This new chapter in his life where he can actually feel like he's a part of a family. A detail I really liked was how well Willa's mom got along with him. even if she, like every non-Roy in the show, only saw him for his money and name. Basically, things are looking up for Connor until you remember he basically paid for Willa, which I think makes him an interesting character. Unlike the rest of the siblings who are constantly trying to up each other in the hierarchy and to overpower their dad, Connor is so detached from that. Instead, he uses his power and wealth to feel loved, which is really sad. He uses it to have a family, to live comfortably in a nice place, and he succeeds in that way. Which isn't to say things work out for him. The note we're left with at the end of the show is that Willa is trying to get as far away from him as possible. I think it's a funny detail that Shiv is the one that points this out to him, by the way, only to get stuck with Tom in the end. But that's why I felt better about him ending at episode 3 than I do with his actual finale ending. This felt very expected and not very conclusive for Connor. It kind of just felt like another Connor episode, which is fine. Like I said, Connor has been such a non-character that for him to come to any real finished place is unlikely. He's gonna move through the rest of his life this way, and I think that's beautiful and also tragic. But that's not to say I think he's unimportant. Seeing a Roy completely outside of the central drama that still struggles to find connection to other people speaks to the deep-rooted trauma every kid in the family has felt, no matter how close or how distant they were to their father. Let's talk about Greg. Greg had a really perfect ending in my opinion, one of my favorites in the show. The way people predicted Kendall taking over but being a broken man at the throne is kind of the actual ending that Greg got, minus the throne. To him, it's a pretty big win though. I mean, he came into this show looking for a job, and he has secured a spot at Waystar under Tom, who will supposedly keep Greg in good hands. But at what cost? Being stuck here under someone who knows so much and could ruin your life, who has made you his property, it's just so juicy. The whole series, I've seen Greg as like one of the main characters of the show, if not the main character, just because the show starts with when he comes into the company. While everyone else was either born into this, already disturbed going into it, or has just been in the company for years, Greg is one of the only characters we get to watch completely lose himself in the pull of the company from the ground up. And to be fair, like I said, he succeeds. When he comes into the show in the pilot, he's looking for a job, and by the end, he's secured employment, which is more than most characters can say by the end of this. But he ends up pretty much the opposite of Roman, forever under Tom. Whereas with most characters, you can sense some sort of awareness for who they've become by the end of the show, Greg makes a deal to sell his soul at the end of season 3, and spends all of 4 without one, to a point where he looks Jess in the eye as she tries to get him not to call the Mencken situation, and he decides to anyway. I mean, just in season 3, you see him really trying to find a connection to someone. He's lonely, trying to make something happen with Comfrey, later trying to get something to happen with a princess. I don't really remember what happened there. He even mistakes what he has with Tom as some sort of connection, the way Tom falls for Shiv in the same way. What was once a kiss on the forehead becomes a sticker, a label for what he represents to Tom, which is kind of the entire message of the show, no? That money will always win over love, but it'll never lead to true happiness. And this being Greg's final shot is one of the most tragic parts about the finale, but it's also one of the most satisfying because this is where he belongs. For many reasons, people turned on Greg this season. He went from a lovable goof to one of the most unlikable characters, but I think that was entirely necessary for his character arc. He was never going to rise up and become CEO. His whole game is making moves in the middle, never really committing to any side, because that way he ends up on the winning team no matter what. But he also never makes any particularly big moves himself because he knows those come with bigger consequences. While I wish I got to see a bit more of Greg on his own, I think the way they show him in small spurts to make his transition into who he becomes very under the surface, I thought that was a really effective choice at the end of the day, and made for one of the most tragic characters I've had the pleasure of watching. Which, speaking of, let's talk about Tom. Oh, brother. Tom is my personal favorite character on the show. Let me make that clear. Part of that is just because he's also from St. Paul. Part of that is because he's just so goddamn weird. Mr. Wamsgans has had, without a doubt, the most fascinating arc of the show. I have seen him hit the highest highs as well as the lowest lows, and the Tom we get at the end here could not be more different than the one we got in the pilot, at least on the surface. Tom ends up CEO, which is such an insane sentence, I can't believe I'm actually saying it out loud. And while that seems on the surface like the win of the show, because, well, it kind of is, it's only because he's agreed to be the pain sponge for Lucas Matson, who is, at times, Shiv's puppet. So in a way, She's kind of above Tom, but I know that's a stretch. You have to look at Tom's situation and question what this CEO role even means at the end of the day. If you're still someone's pain sponge, that is. In some ways, it's anticlimactic that the big winner of the show is still losing in secret, but I would make the argument that Tom doesn't really care, and he obviously knows that. To kind of get to the bottom of this, let me go on a tangent for a little bit. The endings of season 2 and 3 are really great when you put them together. In all of season 2, after the season 1 finale, Kendall kind of has to be Logan's pain sponge, having to look people in the face and fire them because his dad told him to, damage relationships left and right because there was no other way, eventually having to do the most pain sponge shit possible by taking fault for the cruises. But famously, instead of doing that, he betrays his father and becomes the killer his father told him to be. In season 3, Tom is in some ways a new Kendall, becoming the pain sponge for Logan by offering to go to prison. Once that becomes a likely possibility, we watch him suffer for most of the season, similar to Kendall in season 2, but unlike Ken, Tom doubles down with Logan in the end. He also becomes a killer, but this time to Shiv. Now, all of this isn't to say Logan ever personally said Tom should be CEO. You can theorize what was said behind closed doors, but I'm speaking strictly about what was actually said in the show here. What I'm trying to say with this parallel is that to me it read like both Tom and Kendall were put in similar situations, tests if you will. And in the end, Tom, a broken man from his marriage, chose business over love, and Kendall, as always, tried to make the two coexist. The sad thing about Kendall that I'll get to when I talk about him is that he can't really do it because he's his father's son, but the only reason he wants to do it is because he's his father's son, so it's just one tragic cycle. But back to Tom. I do believe Tom was at one point a romantic in the show. I know you could make the case that he was never in this for the love, but I do think he's that guy, which is what's made his arc one of the saddest. You see a man get proven time and time again that love doesn't get you very far in this environment, eventually just using it as a tool rather than anything else. Even his connection with Greg, a fan favorite of the show, it just eventually dilutes into him declaring Greg as his property. I mean, I'm sure to some people that's still kind of hot, but it isn't the kiss we got in season 3, you know? I just find this transformation particularly upsetting. Tom did always want money and power, he confirms this in season 4, but throughout the series he also in some ways loved Shiv. We can talk about their marriage only existing so he could be in the family, and so she could feel above someone else. Of course, that is all true, but I think there was also love somewhere in there. They just have a weird, fucked up definition of what love is. Which is all to say, at the end of the show, while Tom is CEO and will make tons of money, he finally has a label and people won't treat him like he's nothing, he's also stuck to an unfulfilled marriage with a baby on the way, and he's the pain sponge to someone else. The show makes the case for this being one way to work your way to the top of the food chain, but it also ends on a note that makes you feel like it isn't even close to being worth it. That's enough about Tom. Let's talk about Roman. In the end, Roman ends up at a bar ordering Jerry's drink, a martini. He becomes the same goof on the outside of the company that he was in the pilot. In that way, I see his arc as very similar to Jerry, coincidentally, in that everything that happened in this show was just one big weird series of events, and now he's back to where he was to begin with, this time with literal battle scars. But for being one of the few characters who end up in the same spot he started in, I do see Roman as the most changed of all the siblings. The thing most people have said regarding Roman's final shot is that he's free, which I can get down with. In some ways that's true, in a literal sense. He doesn't have to be stuck to the siblings or his dad anymore. He's free of the company and can exist on his own. Like the show itself has pointed out time and time again, Roman was never going to be CEO of a company like this. Who knows if he even wanted to be. He only wanted it because it was a thing he could do to prove to Logan that he wasn't a failure. At the end of the day, it was always a cage to him, which by the way is a delicious callback to the Prague episode where his backstory of being put in a cage is revealed. But company stuff aside, I also think he's free of himself. Cringiest thing I've ever said. When you look at him next to all the other siblings, he really is the only one who seems to have, in this moment at least, learned anything from this entire experience. I'll talk about Shiv in a second, but Kendall still seems in denial at the end of this show. He knows he's defeated, but he doesn't know he's nothing yet. He just is nothing. I really love the fact that one of Roman's final lines is him talking about how they're bullshit, how they're nothing, which is something I really thought about when looking at Tom, who I truly do see as nothing at the end of all this. Again, I see so much of this show as stripping people down to their bare essentials, when money and power mean nothing to them at a certain point. And when you look at Tom, without happiness or love or any sort of fulfillment, what exactly is he at the end of all of this but another lifeless suit with a CEO label? You see him sacrifice his own happiness and his marriage time and time again just so he has a little bit of power. And again, what does that label even do if you're just a pain sponge to someone else at the end of the day? I'm sorry, but he's nothing. And Roman being the single character in the show to recognize this after barely being able to communicate any feeling at all this entire series, that's some serious growth for a character. It's hard to call it a happy ending. I mean, just look at that frown. Because while he is free from the company, I think he feels a tremendous sense of loneliness in the end here. The closest he can get to Jerry at this point is through her favorite drink. The one genuine connection he felt with anyone is now gone. It's hard to see where Roman will go from here. You can sort of see a future for Kendall, and I can very clearly see where Shiv is going after this. But Roman's end feels directionless and scary. But at least there's some self-awareness there. And again, at least he's free. Unlike Shiv. I've dreaded getting to the Shiv section of this video because frankly, I have a hard time talking about Shiv. She puts up a guard around her most of the series and it makes it incredibly difficult to read who she actually is and what exactly her motives are. She's a lot like Logan in that way. Her final play in the show is quite possibly the strongest example of this, changing her mind on voting for Kendall and essentially making her husband Tom the CEO of the company. Her motives for doing this aren't entirely clear. Was this to break the cycle? Was it out of love for Tom? Was it for herself because she knows she has a better chance of moving up through Tom than she does through Kendall? Regardless of what it was, there's no beating around the bush that it's a bit of a tragic ending, in my opinion. Of course, it isn't the loss that Kendall faces, or even Roman. She's still close to the company and could, if she wanted to, continue grinding her way to the top through two men she's successfully manipulated in the past. Which is why, even if you do believe she broke the cycle of abusive power within her family by keeping Kendall from becoming an even more reckless version of his father, it isn't like she isn't also participating in this toxic cycle moving forward. Unless she decides not to, we don't know. On one hand, she stopped Kendall from making things worse, yes, and she herself is closer to power than she's ever been in the show, but she's also reduced to the wife, pregnant with their child, an eerily similar fate to her own mother, someone she really doesn't want to become. Matsson doesn't want her to be the CEO because he knows she's better at his job than he is. He also kind of just wants to have sex with her. As we've seen throughout the show, she's once again put to the side to clean up the mess of a man with more power than herself. This is literally one of the earliest plot lines of the show, her trying to save a campaign because the candidate's husband posted a photo of his asshole. My timing could be off, but I'm pretty sure she's cleaning up this man's mess in the same episode that Logan, mostly unconscious, takes her hand and puts it on his crotch. Just disturbing stuff all around, but it kind of sets the bar for how Shiv is treated this entire show. She's always helping a man rise above and never rising above herself, even in her own marriage, which makes her desperation for power through Logan in the second season make sense. This opportunity to become CEO is like a ticket out of what she's living through. I don't think it's a coincidence that this particular string of episodes in season 2, where we see women in positions of power like Rhea and Nan Pierce, happens to line up with Shiv chasing after the CEO role. Simplifying this down, Shiv really is one of the best examples of why the show is so compelling. Because, in my opinion, I'm allowed to feel bad for Shiv in this way, as a victim of the misogyny in this particular system, while still recognizing how much she participated in it, trying to be one of the boys, and at one point going as far to push a sexual assault victim to not speak up so she could make a bunch of men in power look better. That victim/participant role is what makes her character extremely interesting to me, and it brought an urgent sense of nuance to how feminism is portrayed in pop culture, specifically white feminism. Which, to be clear, I'm not calling Shiv a feminist icon. Nobody who does the things that she did in this show can be considered a feminist icon, in my opinion. All I'm saying is, she's a complicated character who did terrible things. Her fate in the end is tragic, and it's also incredibly fitting for the kind of character she has been from the start. I think all of this can be true. In the end, Shiv is in the car with Tom, and they're doing the hand thing. Tom reaches his hand out for her to hold it. She places her hand there, but they never really complete the hold. Arguably, a top 5 shot in the show, in my opinion. It's such a simple way of communicating a lot of things at once. On one hand, no pun intended, this read to me like Shiv still having even an ounce of power, like she ultimately chose not to hold his hand, as if that means a single thing in the grand scheme of things. But more importantly and more realistically, it obviously just perfectly captures where this marriage is at, if you can call it that at this point. Shiv is trapped, but Tom will never be fulfilled. and also vice versa. In some ways, it's kind of a punchline and a cautionary tale at the same time. Like, all of this sacrifice and emotional trauma was for this. For an unhappy transactional marriage that you're stuck in. Get a good look. These are the winners at the end of the day, technically. But can we really call them that when this is what that looks like? Kendall Roy. Kendall Roy is without a doubt one of the greatest protagonists I've personally ever had the pleasure of watching. He has more drive than anyone in this show, yet he is a complete buffoon nearly every scene he's in. I truly believe he's only ever been in 100% control of a room once in this show, and it was during the press conference. Not even the Living Plus thing was a total success in my opinion. He was kind of embarrassing himself up there. For as unbearable most of his actions are, you can't take your eyes off him, and part of you wants him to succeed, mostly so you could just get this over with. It's a really surreal experience to watch Kendall Roy, because you kind of hate him, but you really want this man to get what he wants. Much of his appeal can be owed to Jeremy Strong, who, make fun of him all you want, brought this character to life in a way that made it hard not to feel for him at least once. When I first started Succession, I remember feeling really annoyed by Kendall. His face was cringy, the way he talked was cringy, he was full of himself, his breakdowns were childish and eye-rolly, and I still consider him to be a terrible and embarrassing person, especially after the final episodes. But I also think he's one of my favorite characters of all time, easily, just because of how enjoyable he is to watch and how much weight he carries on this show. He's a very complicated character. I think he captures a patheticness that's so accurate to the times we're living in, proving himself to be inadequate every step of the way, yet maintaining this I can fix this behavior while an empire actively collapses behind him. Kendall, more than the other characters, carries a sense of urgency with everything he does too. When you're watching him, you believe that if he doesn't land a deal, that'll be the end for him. With Shiv and Roman, they want the job, sure, but Kendall needs the job, or at least he thinks he needs it. It isn't about the job at a certain point, right? It's about Dad's approval, or more than that, it's about being better than Dad. It's a deep-rooted belief that this is what he's meant to do, but that's because his dad told him he could do it when he was a kid, which I think says it all, right? Kendall acts like a child most of the show because he's stuck in that time. He's stuck on this promise. He's always living in this shadow. That's what the show is at the end of the day. Characters whose upbringings and childhood traumas followed them into their lives, and how these traumas aren't things you can really let go of. And Kendall is the brightest example of this. So where does he end up? After coming dangerously close to getting the top spot, Shiv votes no, and he ultimately ends up humiliating himself. He tries to act like he never killed the kid. His biggest argument is that he is the eldest boy. It's pathetic. It's so funny because, like, he spends all of season 3 convincing Shiv and Roman that their father is evil and they should take him down, and then he just becomes his father in season 4 and is surprised when they want to take him down. He burns every bridge on his way out. Jess is gone, Rava is done, Greg isn't coming near him, Shiv wants nothing to do with him after this, and Roman, well, as much as I want to believe that Roman is gone, he is famous for being kicked and then running back for more. I think this shot of Kendall hugging Roman, but doing it directly into his scar, is, if anything, a little too on the nose, with communicating Kendall imitating Logan's abusive form of showing love. Roman has nobody left. It would make sense if he and Kendall ended up together again somehow. Maybe I'm wrong though, we'll never know. But back to Kendall. He ends up not getting what he wants, taking a nice stroll in the park, similar to his dad in the first episode of this season, with Colin following closely behind and gazing out at the water, the sun in his eyes, without the KLR sunglasses on, hence the title, With Open Eyes. In this shot, Colin is sort of a symbol for Kendall's guilt, the one other man besides Logan who knew what happened that night with the waiter, a physical representation of a mistake that will sit with him the rest of his life, and that ultimately cost him the role he chased after his entire life. It's a loss. It's a huge, monumental loss. Unlike past endings of the show where there's ways you could look at it where Kendall might have a shot at coming back, this seems to be a pretty set in stone moment where there is virtually no way he can come back from this, especially after burning all those bridges. Without a Logan to run to, and without a platform where he can imitate Logan, Kendall is reduced to nothing, not a real person, which is why I see some optimism here. He, like Roman, is also now free of his father. In some ways, Shiv saved Kendall, although that is 100% not why she did what she did, but that's where I find Kendall's character to be so tragic. Whether the vote did go through and he finally became CEO, or he ended up where he is now without the top spot, I'm pretty sure still has a lot of money, he was bound to destruct in some way eventually. There was no path where Kendall came out of this unscathed. He hopes he has Logan in him because he's nothing without him, and it's here that he realized he never was his father and never will be. it just sucks. Which feels like a good time to start talking about Logan. While Logan isn't really in the final episode, I still want to talk about his character at the end of all this because he's kind of the most important one. The show is about a lot of things, but you can boil a lot of it down to being about familial trauma being at the center of the media that the rest of society is consuming. Jeremy Strong put it pretty perfectly here.
I mean, this is a family that's at the heart of the media industrial complex, and in a way, when there's toxicity or damage in that family, that's getting pumped out into the groundwater that we're all drinking from. And I think the show is looking at that and taking a hard satirical look at that, but is an indictment of that.
That said, Logan Roy is at the heart of this. He's the man that caused the trauma. He's the man in charge of all the media. The show itself spends some time trying to understand him, but for as present as he is in the show, he is a bit of a mystery. The only other insight into his backstory really is the scars on his back that are only briefly shown somewhere in season 1 and are never referred to again. Only in the second to last episode at his funeral do we learn what happened to his sister. A tragedy that one could assume he's felt guilty of his entire life that made him rethink what a person is. That's a reoccurring question for both Logan and the show. What are people? The show never explicitly answers this, and I'm not here to get into all that, but I think this questioning gets to the heart of who Logan Roy is. Everyone else was transactional to him and distant. For the Roy children to be raised by someone with such a trauma and outlook on the human race, they're going to lack the guidance to become real people themselves, and they know this. A moment in the show that has really stuck with me is when Kendall snaps back at Roman at his birthday party and tells him he's not a real person. There's something about Kieran Culkin's face in this scene that fully lets go of the mask that Roman puts up most of the show. That line stabs him like a knife because he knows it's true. It's why he and the rest of the siblings feel this emptiness inside of them, and Kendall kind of got to the root of that. Near the end of his life, in this diner scene with Colin, Logan understands he's going to die, and there seems to be some acceptance. But he also knows he built this all with legacy in mind, with the assumption that someone will take his spot and do the company justice, which is why I read his final note as bittersweet. On one hand, it is passed on to two people Logan likely trusted the most. His company will, all things considered, be in good hands. But on the other hand, it doesn't stay in the family. His actual death is even spent away from his family on a private jet with people who work for him. No matter how you look at it, that's sad. For as cold-hearted as he is, I do think he goes out a bit bummed, right? His final line to all of the children together is literally that they aren't serious people. That's what we leave on. And he's long past fixing that and more focused on his own legacy. But it's these kinds of actions that bleed into how the kids move forward, and I find that to be pretty tragic. Now that I've talked about the characters, let me get some general thoughts on this last season out. Now that some time has passed, I feel like I have a proper idea of how I felt about season 4. I'll admit, back in 2021 when I called season 3 the show's best, I think that was the recency bias talking, because looking back at it, season 3 had a handful of flaws, despite it still being one of the best things I'd ever seen. I think I feel about the same with season 4, but I think at the end of the day, it's definitely a step up from season 3, and actually I'd go as far to say it's one of the strongest seasons of Succession. If you want to rank, I don't know, let's say from best to worst, 2, 4, 1, 3. Season 4 does feel like the most vulnerable these characters have ever felt. In the past, it has felt like these three main people, specifically Roman, have been one horrible event away from completely splitting open and breaking down. That event happens this season. Logan dies, and in doing so, I feel like you see the true people come out, or at least try to come out. And the truth is ugly and immature, but it helped the show reach a dramatic high that I don't think it's ever reached before, because it feels like I'm watching a bunch of sensitive, incompetent rich people as opposed to just normal, incompetent, rich people. I'll admit, when I watched the season 4 premiere, I was a bit worried, as it seemed like the show picked right back up where it left off and was spinning its wheels in the mud a bit. It definitely needed to push the characters out of their comfort zone, which would require something kind of catastrophic. Boy, did we get that. The way I'm looking at it is that season 2 was just exceptional from a dramatic standpoint. Perfect setups, airtight scripts, great comedic moments. They figured out their voice and they just ran with it. The same can be said about season 4, but it also has the added bonus of way more character depth. It felt like they finally let these actors really dive into the characters' traumas. They knew they were at the end, so they just kind of dove right in. And as a result, you get some extremely raw and honest moments, some of which feel true to experiences I've lived through personally, and others that confirmed that these people are so detached from society. In short, it was some of the most entertaining TV I've ever seen. It was a very strange blend of watching people I will never be and also watching things that I've experienced myself. This isn't to say it's necessarily perfect. Even if it is my favorite show, I can still admit there were things I wish were different. A common complaint about season 4 that I'm on board with is the fact that it is a bit fast. Again, of all the episodes this season, the finale is miraculously not one that comes off rushed, but a good chunk of this, at least after Logan died, moved so quickly. To be fair, it makes sense that the show would just turn into chaos after the main character died and the company's future is up in the air, but I guess I just wished we could have spent more time just, hanging out. Every scene is essential to moving the story forward, but something I love about earlier Succession is how much time you spend just watching these people be ridiculous. This is such a small complaint because that said, it isn't like I disliked any scene in this last season. Throw any of them at me and I could tell you like 10 things I loved about each one. I just wish it wasn't all story. When you zoom out, it really does feel a bit crammed with information and makes me think we could have had a season 5. We could have. Or at least like 13 episodes, not just 10. On a simpler note, I think this season is the show at its best when it comes to the technical aspects as well as the performances. The cinematography is gorgeous. There's plenty that has been said about why the show's cinematography is so great, but this season I really felt like I was overwhelmed by how many great shots there were. Usually, to get a noticeably pretty shot in succession, they have to break away from the usual shooting style, but this season it really felt like they were able to capture some pretty powerful images with loads of meaning within their usual style. That final shot alone is, in my opinion, pretty masterful. The choice to shoot something this warm for such a tragic moment added a lot of nuance to it. It makes you feel like there's just a little bit of hope. It also literally is him looking directly into the sunlight, again, hence the title With Open Eyes. There's also the subtle choice to have the benches in the back line up with his neck and have those benches line up with Colin. There's no doubt in my mind I'm reading into this too deeply at this point, but the final image of the show being Kendall with a line through his neck, it's a pretty cool choice. I love it, even if I'm overreading it. And then there's the score, which is so dramatic this season. It's noticeably more dramatic. Like, they brought in English horns, they brought in a choir. I mean, the show is dramatic as is, don't get me wrong, but this makes it feel like I'm watching something way more epic than what it is. In short, it's just some of Nicholas Britell's finest work, easily. So as a whole, while I do still like season 2 just a bit more, I do think this was an incredibly strong season. Most of the show's best moments happened this season, and I'm not alone in saying Connor's wedding was probably the best episode of TV I've ever seen. Reddit, Twitter, sometimes even I would theorize ridiculous things that the show could do, like Greg being the winner of it all, and Kendall killing himself, sometimes even Willa killing herself. I really thought that was going to happen. But now that it's over, I'm so glad the show kept itself grounded while still keeping things absurd and surprising. I think that's something I especially appreciate about the finale here, not leaning into fan service stuff. It doesn't have an epic over-the-top moment. Even Jeremy Strong tried jumping into the water in that final shot to play up the extreme tragedy of it all, but thankfully they didn't leave that in because, let's admit, that would have been a little bit corny. And frankly, keeping things real and subtle not only keeps the show from looking silly, but it also makes things more interesting. It doesn't hand anything to you on a silver platter. It opens itself up to dozens of interpretations, all of which work dramaturgically. No idea if I use that word right. I'll be honest. Let's just move on. To summarize, it was a great season. I loved this season. Don't know when we'll ever get a collection of episodes this strong again. My throat is kind of sore, so I think it's time to wrap this up. Clearly, I love to just ramble on about Succession, and if anyone is still watching, well, I'm amazed. Some final thoughts are that after I finished Breaking Bad in high school, the first show I ever fell in love with, I was genuinely depressed for weeks, trying to find any show that could fill the void. I didn't want it to be over. I tried Dexter. Can you believe I thought Dexter could match the quality of Breaking Bad? What a fool. Nothing made me feel that kind of love for a show until Succession. I've been a fan for about 3 years now of this show. I was late to the game, but this show has meant so much to me. It's a brilliant satire for the times we're living in. It's also hilarious in a way where even the most overquoted lines in the show still make me smile every now and then. It's also beautifully presented, capturing some of these extravagant places on film while still being able to capture the dark ugliness of them at the same time. The music is some of the best film/TV music I've ever heard. The performances are all impeccable and committed in a way you rarely see. They make it look easy and completely absorb you. The writing, I don't even need to say anything about the writing. I own the scripts in physical form. And it's just sad. It's just a really sad show, and I hope by now you have a decent idea why. For as long as this has been easily my longest video, I really do not think I even scratched the surface. I have to kind of admit that right now. I don't think there will ever be a day where I can talk about everything I love about Succession in one sitting. It's too much. But that's what makes it great. I know there's probably amazing things about this show that I haven't even really discovered yet, that I will keep discovering the more I rewatch it. It's the kind of show that's so rich with shit that I'll just watch it for the rest of my life, probably. I love it. I love it so much. I'm deeply grateful for Jesse Armstrong, and I will miss this show quite a bit. I think that's all I have to say for now. Thanks for watching. Please go watch Succession and form your own opinion. And before you head out, I have some new merch. If you liked this video, consider buying a shirt. They're really good quality, to be honest. Okay, bye.